colleague you, and I will be presenting on a biblical idea of government and economics on the Republic of Finland. As we start off, I will give a brief overview of the biblical principles of government and economics. I will then analyze the government and economics in Finland and then compare and contrast the two. So first off, I want to talk about the origin of government. So wholly looking at scripture, first thing we see is that government was established by God. Colossians 1:6 says, "For by him all things were created, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities." God created government. Next, we see that government is ordained by God. In Daniel 2:21, it says, "He removes kings and he sets up kings." Psalm 75:7, "But it is God who executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another." My next point is that government is sustained by God. In Proverbs 19:21, scripture says, "But it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." And lastly, I want to point out that government culminates with Christ. In this world of government, which has not always been the best, there's been a lot of hurt and pain because of wars and unjust rulers. And so believers can have a peace knowing that one day God's kingdom will have everlasting reign and will have no end to peace. And that's from Isaiah 9:6, where scripture says, "And the government shall be upon his," which is Jesus's shoulder, "of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end." I want to look at a couple forms of government that we see in the Old Testament. And first, I want to point out a democracy. So we see this exemplified in Genesis in several occasions when the Israelites are going to the Tower of Babel and they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city. Let us make a name for ourselves." And in the form of democracy, the majority is right, though not always ethically or righteous in their decisions. And so the only efficient form of democracy is when the people are following God's commands. And unfortunately, that's not always the case in this world because humans are fallen. And so my next form of government that I want to look at is a theocracy, which we see in Jeremiah 32:28, where God says, "And they shall be my people, and I will be their God." And this was the case in the early years of Scripture and during the time of Judges, where God was the king and gave forms of people to help communicate what he was saying. But at the end of the time of Judges, the people of Israel rebelled from acknowledging God as their king and asked for a king. And this is where we see a monarchy form of government come in. In 1 Samuel 8:5, the people are saying, "Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Now, it wasn't wrong that they wanted a king. What was wrong was that they would no longer acknowledge God as their king. And so they were granted a king, but with it came the evils of the world, of wars and unjust decisions and just evil. So after reviewing some of these, I wanted to know, what does scripture point us to? And I came to the conclusion that scripture points us to a limited government. In Matthew 22:21, it says, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And this is commonly used as a scripture for advocating for limited government, but I think it has its place there. Next, I want to look at the biblically mandated roles and responsibilities of government. So in Romans 13, we see 2 points of how government is called to act. And one of them is a negative role. This is in no way something wrong, but a negative role is a way to describe government as punishing evil. It doesn't necessarily provide something, but it demands justice and vengeance for wrongdoers and for evil people. Next, we see that government is supposed to promote good in social justice and ethical justice. And this is seen in the passages in Romans 13, where it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad." That's the negative role. And then the next role is, "Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval." And that's talking about promoting good. The next point that I believe government should play is separate spheres of authority. And that's, again, going back to Matthew 22, 20 through 21, where it talks about giving to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. As believers and as people, we have authority placed over us, government placed over us that God has ordained. And so we are supposed to honor and respect and submit. And so that's where we give, and we pay taxes and to our government, but then we do not forget and we don't turn away from our true King, who is God. Next, I want to look at the Christian responsibility in regards to government. So my first point is we are to honor and submit to authority. This is just what I was talking about, of give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Honor and submit to those that God has put in authority over us. Next, I want to talk about a way to respectfully challenge authority. When we look at the example of Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were called to worship an idol from their king, and they respectfully challenged that, and they were willing to take the consequences, which would have been death had not God been protecting them. And so from an article written by Art Lindsay, it's titled, "Is Government at its Root Good or Bad?" He talks about what it is to submit or to respectfully challenge. And I quote, what he requires is submission, a term that calls for placing oneself under someone else. Here, and in verse 5, he seems to avoid using the stronger word obey. And the reason is that the believer may find it impossible to comply with every demand of government. A circumstance may arise in which he must choose between obeying God and obeying men. But even then, he must be submissive to the extent that if his Christian convictions do not permit his compliance, he will accept the consequences of his refusal. Next, I want to point out that believers should pray for authority. 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 2, Scripture talks about praying for kings and all who are in high positions. And that's a responsibility that believers have. Next, the last point that I want to talk about is engage. Believers are called to engage. In the Garden of Eden, Adam was mandated to fill the earth and subdue it. And so that role takes place in so many different ways. So in Matthew 26:11, Jesus says, "For you always have the poor with you." And as much as government can provide health care and homeless shelters and much more, it is the believer's role to be active in those areas, to take care of the poor and the destitute and the orphan and the widow. We're also supposed to be active in our government and responsible. Next, I want to analyze the government and economics in Finland, and I'll do this by a brief overview of the history and geography timeline, some important dates. So the history and geography of Finland, the official title is the Republic of Finland. Its capital is Helsinki. Geography, it's a largely coastal and agricultural country. It's in the northern region of Europe, and it borders Sweden, Norway, and Russia. Its economy pre-1900s was agriculture and coastal trade, largely agricultural, almost 90%. And post-1900s, it is timber, which they call green gold, and mining, chemical, and metallurgical industries. Its population is 5.5 million, and the language is Finnish and Swedish, which I'll explain why they have two languages. Here is a brief timeline split up in several different eras. In 1150 through 1809, this is termed the Swedish rule, when the Swedes came in and defeated the Finnish people that were living there, but instead of conquering and taking all of Finland under its rule, they cohabitated. And the Swedes kind of infiltrated Finland, where the elite and educated language was Swedish, and most of the peasantry still spoke Finnish. So at the Diet of the Forest States, this was the form of government that was established for the Swedish-Finnish country. A lot of elite Finnish people would go to help manage the kingdom affairs. So Swedish became the language of law and commerce. Finnish was still spoken, but not as much. And Finland really suffered a lot from Sweden's wars with other neighboring states. Sweden defeated and transferred Finland, was defeated and transferred Finland to Russia in 1809. And this is the Russian Grand Duchy of Finland. So from 1809 to 1970, Finland was under Russian rule. But instead of, again, defeating the people, the ruler, which was Tsar Alexander I, decided to woo that country into working alongside them. And so through the years, in 1863 was the rise of Finnish nationalism. This was encouraged by European romantic nationalism